My name is Noah Vance. I worked 14 years for the Forest Service. My last assignment was in the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest in Washington State. To be precise, the section near the Cascades, a dense, cold, and wet area. It's a huge place. Douglas firs that touch the clouds, a mist that never leaves, and a silence so ancient it presses against your chest. The cabin I was assigned was called Refuge 57, an old service structure from the 30s. 3 log walls, 1 wall of old sheet metal that rattled in the wind. No cell service, just an emergency radio that sometimes worked, my propane heater, and my own head for company. At first, the solitude was paradise. I knew the forest's smell, wet earth, pine needles, melting snow. I knew the forest was alive. My job was routine, walking, checking trails, maintaining wildlife logs. But the forest teaches its own rules. The first rule you learn is, what gets lost stays lost. Things hikers leave behind, gloves, thermoses, a flashlight. But one day, the pattern changed. The things I found weren't lost. They were left. It happened during a week-long patrol near Coldwater Lake. I found a boot, not a ripped boot, but an almost new hiking boot, placed right in the center of the trail. Clean sole, laces tied, as if someone had carefully removed it and set it there. I thought it was a prank. I nudged it with my foot. 2 days later, on a route 3 kilometers away, I found the other boot. Same model, same condition. It was placed on a cut tree stump, perfectly oriented toward where I had found the first one. This wasn't an accidental loss. This was a deliberate message. And the detail that chilled me was that on the sole of the second boot, there was no mud or earth. There was fine river sand. But the nearest river was 8 kilometers away and at a totally different elevation. Someone had walked a long way to leave that clean print. I took the boots back to the cabin. I stored them. I told myself it was the work of an eccentric hiker, but that night, as I warmed my soup, the usual silence broke. I heard a sound outside, in the dense fog. It wasn't an animal, it was a step, a slow, heavy step on the dry pine needles, right at the edge of the clearing. It wasn't the rhythm of a walking person, it was the cadence of someone who stops, observes, and then takes another step. I felt like the forest had intercepted me, and whatever it was, it knew I was there, and by the rhythm, it was in no hurry. After the boots and the slow step, the cabin stopped being a refuge. It became an observation box. I slept with the rifle nearby, although I knew the rifle wouldn't save me from the doubt. The sound returned, not every night, but sporadically. It was a deliberate cadence, one step after another, but the source was never in the same place. One night it came from the back wall, the next from the side of the creek. I felt like whatever was stalking me was mapping my space, learning my habits. I decided to stop ignoring the environmental details that my logic dismissed. I started logging everything in my service notebook. The change in the air's scent, the way the wind suddenly stopped, the total absence of birds in the clearing at certain hours. One morning, the sky was clear and the air was freezing. I went out to patrol the perimeter, right at the tree line, where I had heard the step the night before. I found something that brought me to my knees. On the ground, there was an improvised map. It was a formation of small animal bones, rodents and rabbits. They weren't broken, but placed with an unnerving geometry. They were straight lines, curves, and small circles. A map. I approached slowly. I studied it. Whatever had done this must have worked in the dark, in absolute silence. The bones were clean, polished by the weather, but their arrangement was recent. What terrified me wasn't the presence of bones, but the intellect behind their placement. And in the center of that bone map, there was something different. A small piece of carved wood. It wasn't an artistic carving. It was a crude work, as if done with a dull knife. The wood fragment was from the same old pine that my cabin was built with. I picked up the wood piece. I felt its rough, dry texture. It was on the ground, but it had no dirt. It was clean. That meant it had been taken from the cabin, manipulated, and placed in the center of that bone map with a cold precision. It had stolen a piece of my refuge. It had marked it, and it had given it back to me as a clue. I realized I wasn't dealing with an animal. I was dealing with something that played with the concept of home and territory. The forest wasn't just watching me. It was interacting with me in a way that forced me to participate in a game I didn't understand. And the fear became deeper, more real, more physical. I took the piece of wood into the cabin. I examined it under my oil lamp. It wasn't a normal cut. It seemed to have been ripped from the cabin with a dry force, as if an old tool or something very hard had been used. The cabin, my refuge, was already compromised. I spent the afternoon searching for where that piece had been torn off. I searched the perimeter 10 times. I didn't find the gap. The wood simply didn't belong to any visible part. It was as if it had been extracted from a hidden area, from the very essence of the logs. That night, anxiety took over. I decided not to sleep. I sat by the propane stove, the rifle on my lap. The air inside the cabin felt heavy and cold despite the lit stove. This cold was different from winter. It was a dense cold, as if the humidity had condensed all at once. It was around 2 in the morning when I heard a whisper. It didn't come from the radio. It didn't come from the window. It came from the chimney. The cabin had a thin metal ventilation pipe for the propane, and from that pipe came the sound. It was a low, moist, and constant murmur. It was a voice, but it didn't articulate words. It was the sound of someone trying to speak with a mouth full of thick liquid, a gargling sound mixed with labored breathing. The voice was deep, guttural, but with a rhythmic cadence that felt strangely familiar. I turned off the lamp so the sound of breathing wouldn't distract me. And in the darkness, I realized the murmur wasn't just a voice. It was breath. A cold breath that I could feel in the cabin. The sound came from the pipe, but the sensation of breath came from the space behind me. I froze. The rifle aimed at the chimney. The smell in the air changed. The scent of pine and propane was gone. An odor of rusted metal and concentrated dampness filled the air, like the inside of an old pipe that has been underground. The whisper stopped, and it was replaced by a slow, sucking sound, as if something was vacuuming the air out of the cabin. I felt a sharp pain in my eardrums from the pressure change. The pressure told me that whatever was there wasn't using the chimney as a conduit. It was using the air itself as a medium, and it was right beside me. It was drinking my atmosphere. Terror forced me to act. I fired the rifle at the ceiling, a dull, deafening shot in the dark. The sound broke the void. The breathing stopped. The smell left. I turned on the light. There was nothing. The cabin was in order, but the fear was no longer an emotion. It was a physical condition. At dawn, I decided I couldn't leave without understanding. I had to find the source of the disturbance before abandoning the cabin. Logic told me to run, but professional curiosity, or perhaps madness, kept me there. I went out with my machete and my rifle. I checked the perimeter, focusing on the ground, and right on the threshold of the door, where the foot enters the refuge, I found something. The dirt around the threshold was disturbed, turned over, and in the dirt, there was a thin layer of fine river sand, the same sand I had seen on the boot. And in that sand, I found a pattern. There were 3 thin lines drawn in the sand, connected by a small circle. It was a miniature, simplified version of the bone map. It was drawn with almost surgical precision. And then, I noticed the most chilling detail. The 3 lines weren't drawn with a stick or a tool. Next to the figure, there was a fragment of a human fingernail, a large, thick, perfectly white and clean nail. It had been used as a drawing tool and then abandoned. The nail and the river sand, the boot and the bone map, everything was connected. Someone or something was following a slow ritual, and it was doing it with the remnants it found in the forest. And that ritual had me, my cabin, as its center. I looked at the drawn figure. I felt it wasn't a threat, but a signature, a marker of ownership. I stood there, on the threshold, and I felt time slowing down. The sun wasn't moving. The wind had stopped. I had a horrible certainty. What was stalking me wasn't operating under human time. It moved at its own slow, measured pace. And that slowness was what made it undetectable. The fear wasn't of speed, but of the infinite patience the creature possessed. I made the decision. I wasn't going to use the radio. I wasn't going to let them hear me talk about this. If this was a ritual, I had to break it in silence. I took my essentials, the rifle, the map, the flashlight. I left the piece of carved wood on the table, right in the center of the moisture circle. It was a silent exchange. I walked out of the cabin, and as I headed toward the trail, the silence returned. But this time, the silence was different. It was a silence of satisfaction, a silence that was bidding me farewell. I walked 7 hours to the main highway. The whole way, I didn't see a single animal, not a squirrel, not a bird. Life had been expelled from the area. I reached the service guard post at the park boundary. My colleague, old Ben, saw me and was surprised. He asked why I had left the cabin without notice. I gave him a simple story. Propane failure, needed supplies. He nodded. He seemed calm. As I drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror. The road, the park fence, the entrance sign, and on that sign I saw a small, dark, moist smudge. A dark substance the size of a coin, the same one I had seen on the knife. I stopped. My heart pounded with fury. I got out of the car and walked back to the sign. The wooden sign was dry, the sun shining on it. But on the lower part, I saw 3 tiny marks. 3 precisely made scratches, identical to those on the sand map. And next to the marks, the dark, gelatinous substance that had marked my knife. Someone hadn't just followed me. It had waited for my departure, and it had left a final message in the one place I thought was safe. The exit door. I got back in the car and drove without looking back. I live in the city now. I'm no longer a park ranger, but I ask myself, the creature, or whatever was there, took the peace from the cabin. It took the fear from my life. But it left me the carved piece of wood on the table, and it left me a map of bones in the clearing. I wonder if it wanted me to understand it. I wonder if it wanted me to be the one to tell the story to continue its ritual. and I wonder if the breath I heard in the chimney wasn't a threat, but an invitation for me to join the slow cadence. And if one day I will find a human fingernail drawing a line in the dirt of my own backyard.